talks most recently at the Detroit Historical Museum and Macomb County Community College for the Michigan Historical Society. He's currently writing a book about the radio character Captain Midnight. And he's here today with a special guest who we'll get to meet later to tell us all about the Detroit origin of the Lone Ranger, Green Hornet, and Sergeant Preston radio and TV shows. Please help me welcome Larry Zebb.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm here today to talk to you about the Lone Ranger, and it's a character with a Troy connection. Yes, you'll find out about that later. We're going to talk about the actors on the show and a trip to the Maccabees building, and we're going to end it with an 11-minute movie about radio sound effects, and we're going to have a question and answer session where I save your questions till the very end. I've spoken about the Lone Ranger at several venues, a lot of them, and very rarely do I get to have a special guest. And I was completely thrilled when this is at least the second time I've had this guest. And this is a lady who once upon a time stood across the microphone from the Lone Ranger and Tonto at the WXYZ studios. Shirley Ann Russell on the Lone Ranger. Oh, are we there? And Shirley is here today, and she's sitting right there. Shirley Ann Russell. She played child parts on the Lone Ranger, beginning around 1938, and hopefully at the end you'll ask her most of the questions, because she's the expert. I'm just the guy talking. I want to tell you a little bit about Shirley. She came to my house once, and she has at least one radio script. And so we looked at the script, and her and I were reading it as we were listening to the show. And I think Shirley said that was the first time she ever heard herself on the radio. And it was at my house. And so we put the show on. The show was called Children of the West. It was broadcast on October 21st, 1938. On that show, there was a man named Dave who was watching two children, Johnny and Edith, played by Billy Roy, I believe, was it? And Shirley. Dave has the children doing odd jobs around town. And the houses that the children worked at, suddenly they found that valuables were missing. So they thought little Johnny and Edith were stealing things from the houses. So Shirley was playing like a little crook. But she really wasn't a crook, because at the end, the Lone Ranger and Tonto found out that they found a ring on Dave and found out that Dave was the mastermind, and he was just using the children to ask them questions if there were any valuables in the house. The children were completely innocent. So at the very end of the show, Johnny and Edith were adopted by a couple who without children and given a happy home. So that was the episode. And Shirley was in other ones, but this is the one that we could identify because she actually has the script for this show. So that's one of the shows Shirley did. Okay, we're going to talk about the origin of the Lone Ranger. Oh, by the way, here's a picture of Shirley. This is Shirley and I at the Maccabees building in downtown Detroit. And that's the director's booth behind us. Shirley and I went down there one day. You just can't walk in there. You have to know somebody, and I know somebody, so Shirley and I got in there. So I have more pictures of the Maccabees later on. The origin of the Lone Ranger, there were six, this is the reason that the Lone Ranger is who he is. There were 6 Texas Rangers. They were trailing a character named Butch Cavendish into Bryant's Gap Canyon, and it was a trap. Cavendish's men were all around the canyon with guns, looking down on him, and when all the Rangers came into the canyon, they fired and they apparently killed them all. And it was getting dark, so Cavendish and his men looked down and they could see everybody was dead, and so they just left. Well, the next morning an Indian came by and he found the bodies, and he found that one man was still alive. So what he did was there were 6 Rangers. He buried the 5 dead ones and made an extra grave for the 6th living man. so that if Cavendish ever came back, he would find 6 graves and be sure that he killed all of the rangers. So now Tonto takes this ranger into a cave and nurses him back to health. And a couple weeks later, finally the ranger is good enough, feels well enough to ask, and he found out that the Indian's name was Tonto, and he asked, Tonto, what happened to the others? And Tonto looks at him and says, others all dead, you Lone Ranger. So that's how we got the name the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger. His motivation for the rest of the series was to avenge the death of the Rangers and to capture Butch Cavendish, which he did eventually. The Lone Ranger had a pledge and a code that he wanted all the children to tell the truth, obey their parents, be kind to animals, and eat 3 square meals a day, including a good breakfast of Cheerios. This is the Maccabees building. The Lone Ranger was not broadcast from some exotic western location. It was broadcast from good old Detroit, Michigan at the Maccabees building, which is almost across from the Detroit Institute of Arts, right on Woodward Avenue. 15th floor, you'll notice it says WXYZ at the top. Nowadays it'll say Wayne State University on top of there, but the tower is still there. And that's where we were up in there. So anyway, many of the stories were written by a man named Franz Stryker. He was a freelance writer from Buffalo. This is the most important person in creating the Lone Ranger. This is George Washington Trendle. He had a partner, John Kunsky, and him and his partner owned Detroit movie theaters. Luckily for them, they sold them just before the Depression, and they made a lot of money, and they decided to go into radio. So they bought a radio station named WGHP, and those GHP stood for the original owner, George Harrison Phelps. They bought it in 1930, and Trendle wanted to change the call letters to WXYZ, and he needed to get rights from the Army and Navy to do it because they had it reserved. Finally, he managed to get the call letters, so he called his station WXYZ, the last word in broadcasting. He was with CBS, but decided to go independent. He thought he could make more money that way. So he had to develop new programming. And the first show, one of the earliest shows he did was a show called Warner Lester. This is before The Lone Ranger. And it was created in 1932. It was a detective show. When Mr. Trendle owned movie theaters, he found out that most people, well, the children loved Western shows. So he asked his staff, why don't we come up with an idea for a modern day Robin Hood, like a Western? So he called his staff together, they had a staff meeting. Let's develop a character name, we have an unnamed character, and everyone come up with an idea, and a week from now come back and we'll talk about it. So the staff, they thought about it, and they had all kinds of great ideas. Franz Stryker, the writer, came back the next week and thought they should have a safety club. Another person suggested William Tell Overture as the theme music. Others mentioned he should wear a mask, silver bullets, and he should be riding a horse. And so every person who was at that meeting left thinking that they created the Lone Ranger. Little did they know, but after the show became a success, each one of those people received a letter from Mr. Trendle, and it was called Assignment of Authorship. For $10 in future considerations, each one of those persons had to sign away any kind of rights to the Lone Ranger. The future considerations were their jobs. You either sign this or you lose your job in the Depression. Well, guess what everybody did? They all signed their rights over to Mr. Trendle, and he became the sole creator of the Lone Ranger, even though all he did was plant the seed. He hired a man named Brace Beamer, as station manager. And then there was a few people that played the Lone Ranger there, but the first permanent Lone Ranger was a 24-year-old student at Wayne State University, Earl Grouser. He had a really mature-sounding voice for being only 24 years old. And the show ran for about a week or so, and Mr. Trendle said there's too much talk and not enough action. So the director, Jim Jewell, interviewed, he said that somebody had to explain to the audience what is going on in the Lone Ranger's mind. He can't keep on talking to his horse. So they called a staff meeting and said, okay, what are we going to do about this? They said, he should have a partner. Okay, who's the partner going to be? Should it be a woman? And Mr. Trendle said, no romance on this show. So someone suggested an Indian, and Mr. Trendle thought about it, and he said, all right, we'll have an Indian as long as he's like the sidekick and never the main star. So they hired a man named John Todd to play Tonto. And at the time he started in 1933, John Todd was 57 years old. This is what John Todd looked like without the Tonto outfit. There's Tonto. There's John Todd. They called each other Kimosabe. It's interesting where they got that name. They got it from Jim Jewell, he went to Mullet Lake and he found a camp in Mullet Lake called Camp Kimosabe. And Jim Jewell said, let's use that name, and that's what they can call each other. This is an early cast photograph of the Lone Ranger cast. What's interesting about this is the man who's playing the Lone Ranger, which is Earl Grouser, which is this man right there, is not the Lone Ranger in this picture. The Lone Ranger is Brace Beamer, the taller man. The reason that is because Mr. Trendle thought that Brace Beamer looked like his vision of the Lone Ranger. And the shorter man be on his right-hand side with the little mustache, that's really the Lone Ranger. But in publicity, all publicity shots, even though he was not the Lone Ranger, they used Brace Beamer as the Lone Ranger in publicity shots. Here's a picture of Brace dressed up really like the Lone Ranger, a really early shot from the studio. So the Lone Ranger was a hit, and they decided to have a public appearance of the Lone Ranger. So they had an event on July 30th, 1933 on Belle Isle for the Detroit Parks and Recreation. 10,000 children attended the circus in front of the casino. Brace Beamer came out dressed as the Lone Ranger, and they rented a horse from the circus. And he appeared. He came out riding on this horse, and when all these kids saw the Lone Ranger, they attacked. They just ran toward. They broke through the guards and ran toward him. Brace was a real horseman. He knew, and he was afraid that the horse was going to get spooked. So he stood up and he told the kids on silver, "Children, scouts, go back to your posts." And they all did. They followed the Lone Ranger's instructions. And they all went back to their posts, and everything was fine, and he rode off, and everything was great. This is the first premium picture. This is when I first got into radio. How I got into radio was I collected the little toys that were offered on the show. And some of they weren't really toys, but they offered photographs. And this is the photograph, the first photograph that they would have offered on the Lone Ranger. Notice that in this picture, he's not wearing a mask. This is how early this photograph is. He's wearing more of a bandana over the lower part of his face. And what they did was they took a picture of Brace on a horse and they superimposed this background on it. And so that's the first premium picture. You would think that with all the thought that went into the Lone Ranger, that they would have thought the most obvious things. That you would have thought they would have offered Tonto a horse. Well, guess what? In some of the early episodes, Tonto does not have a horse. He had to ride on Silver along with the Lone Ranger and run next to him. Finally, they gave Tonto a horse, and his name was Whitefeller, and then later the horse was named Scout. This is an early studio shot. There was like a main studio. This is probably where Shirley would be with the Lone Ranger. And the man with the stick, he's hitting a pillow on the chair, and that's the gunshot. The Lone Ranger was a success. So Mr. Trendle, we're doing so well, let's have another character. So they said, let's have like a modern day Lone Ranger, brought up to date. So again, the staff was called together and they did the same thing. Everyone had great ideas and Mr. Trendle took credit. And he was the modern day Lone Ranger, and this person turned out to be the Green Hornet. The Green Hornet was played by Al Hodge, and later on, when he was on television, Al Hodge was kept in video. In 1938, Republic Pictures, the Lone Ranger was such a hit, the Republic Pictures came out with a serial, and it was starring, they didn't use the radio characters, they used all new actors in this show. None of the radio characters appeared in these movies. It was starring Lee Powell as the Lone Ranger. And this was in 1938, but in 1944, Lee Powell was with the Marines in the Pacific. And it turned out that they captured a Japanese camp and they drank some sake and it was poisoned and he died. So the man who played the Lone Ranger in 1938 ended up being a victim of the war. And in the next year, now this wasn't because Powell was still available, but they decided to change the actors, and Robert Livingston now was the Lone Ranger. This was the Lone Ranger Rides Again from 1939. Now there's a little quiz here for you. There was a couple people who were on the show. There was a lot of them who were on the show who turned out to be famous, but I'm just going to talk about two of them right now. And I want you, if anybody knows who these people are who were on their Lone Ranger show, who later became more popular doing other things. The first person was Myron Wallace. Anybody know who Myron Wallace is? Nobody? Myron Wallace was on the Lone Ranger, and he later became Mike Wallace. He's a University of Michigan graduate, and he was the announcer on the Lone Ranger and probably played a few bit parts. Another person was named Amos Jacobs. Anybody? Amos Jacobs was on the Lone Ranger show. He was Danny Thomas. Around Christmas time, 1938, Kern's department store in Detroit had a Lone Ranger village. And this is one of their windows that the kids could go up and see the Lone Ranger and all the toys. They had a village where you could take an elevator, and they'd have a little elevator boy dressed in a Lone Ranger costume who would take you up to the floor where they have the Lone Ranger village. And that little man who was dressed up as a Lone Ranger, I'm going to talk to him about him in a little while. When you got up there, this is what you saw. They would have a little Lone Ranger village where you could see this like a 2/3 replica of the Lone Ranger, and you could get your picture taken in front of the Lone Ranger for 25 cents. Or you could buy toys up there. You could buy a Lone Ranger outfit. You could buy a tin wind-up by Marx, the Lone Ranger, wind him up and watch him go. Or get yourself some Lone Ranger bubble gum. In 1938, about the same time, Mr. Trendle had let's have another show. Let's get the staff together and create another show. Staff got together, he signed the papers over, Mr. Trendle got everything, and this one was the star of this show was going to be a dog. So the show became Challenge of the Yukon, starring Sergeant Preston. Later the show was called Sergeant Preston, but it started out as being called Challenge of the Yukon, starring J. Michael. When the show went to television, it was a man named Richard Dick Simmons played Sergeant Preston. His name was Richard Simmons. Don't mistake him for this guy. This is Richard Simmons, not this guy. Not the exercise guy. Everything was running smoothly at WXYZ. The show was broadcast on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But on Monday, April 7th, 1941, the unthinkable happened. They just the cast for the Lone Ranger just finished the later broadcast for the West Coast, and Earl Grouser, who was a Lone Ranger, was driving home. He lived in Farmington. He was driving home on Grand River. Now it was early morning, Tuesday, April 8th. He fell asleep at the wheel and was killed instantly. The show was broadcast Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and this is Tuesday morning. They needed a new Lone Ranger the next day. Mr. Trendle made a statement on Tuesday saying that he's sorry that it happened, but the Lone Ranger goes on, and they'll have a new Lone Ranger tomorrow. They called a staff meeting. Everyone suggested ideas. Who should be the Lone Ranger? And Chuck Livingston, who was the director at the time, said, well, you know, Brace does all your public appearances. And everyone looked at Mr. Trendle, and Mr. Trendle said, well, we'd have to break him in easy. So, on that Wednesday, Brace Beamer became the Lone Ranger. The storyline was they rewrote the scripts where the Lone Ranger couldn't talk. Because Mr. Trendle didn't want to have the shock of a new voice shocking the children. They would realize that if they just heard the Lone Ranger on Monday, if they hear a new voice on Wednesday, they'll be shocked. So now they have he can't talk. So for about a week, the Lone Ranger couldn't talk. Finally, they worked him in, and the kids, it was seamless, and the kids didn't seem to notice. This is one of the toys that I would have collected. This is a warning siren from the Lone Ranger. This is what Tonto used to signal the Lone Ranger when there was trouble. And then they offered him to their children. In 1944, WXYZ needed more working space. So they moved to the Mendelson Mansion. It was on Jefferson Avenue. Right now, it's been torn down. This is about the time Shirley left the show, because when Shirley got to be a certain age, that little girl voice was gone and she became a teenager and they didn't want her anymore, right, Shirley? That little boy who was the elevator operator going up to the Kearns department store was Fred Foy, who, when you hear the Lone Ranger broadcast or even on television, this is the voice you hear where he says, if I were a horse with the speed of light, this is the man that you hear. He's the most popular Lone Ranger announcer. The Lone Ranger had a lot of toys they offered on the show, but there was one toy that I just can't figure out why the Lone Ranger ever offered this. It seems so unlike him. In 1948, they offered an atom bomb ring. I don't get it. Why would the Lone Ranger offer an atom bomb ring? The idea was you take off the red cap on the back and you would see like atoms bouncing around. Sounds dangerous to me. In 1949, television was replacing radio, and all the shows were going to television, and Mr. Trendle decided they would do a Lone Ranger television show. Brace Beamer wanted to play the Lone Ranger, but Mr. Trendle said he didn't want to use Brace because Brace was a sure thing on the radio and television was experimental. So they wanted to keep Brace doing the Lone Ranger on radio. So the Lone Ranger was planned to be on the radio and television at the same time. So Mr. Trendle went out to California. They had a lot of people from Detroit go out there and run the show. But the actors were California actors. And hello, okay. And so Mr. Trendle interviewed one man named Clayton Moore. And the reason Mr. Trendle liked Clayton Moore was that he sounded a lot like Brace Beamer. So he looked at Clayton Moore and he asked Clayton Moore, "Clayton, would you like to be the Lone Ranger?" And Clayton Moore looked at him and said, "Mr. Trendle, I am the Lone Ranger." And so Clayton Moore got the part of the Lone Ranger. This is probably the Lone Ranger everyone thinks is the Lone Ranger, but... And he needed a Tonto, so they got another Tonto named Jay Silverheels. It's crazy, when they made public appearances, during the time when the show was on the radio and television at the same time, Brace Beamer appeared, this is at public appearances now, like at circuses and things. Brace Beamer was the Lone Ranger and Jay Silverheels was Tonto. Mr. Trendle felt that Clayton Moore was too old for the part. He was 35 years old. And he wanted a younger man and who might not charge as much. So after two seasons, well, here's a cast photograph. There's Tonto. Tonto was on this is a 1953 cast photograph. Tonto was on the far right. Shirley, that's your friend on the edge of the table there, that sound man. Do you recognize him? Right at the edge of the table, kneeling down in front of. Do you recognize him? No? The man you just met the other...
Oh, you're talking to me?
Yeah. You don't recognize him?
Yeah, Bill Hemston.
Okay. Shirley just met him. The man who was kneeling down in front, she just had lunch with him.
We reunited after 70 years.
Yeah. So they got a man, Mr. Trendle, for the third season, got a man named John Hart to play the Lone Ranger, thinking that everything would be fine and the kids they'll never notice that we changed. This guy's a lot cheaper. Well, guess what? The kids noticed. They tried putting a larger mask on. Look at the difference. Look at the mask here. The mask goes down over the eyes and then it goes over the nose. That's the Lone Ranger that most kids remembered. And Mr. Trendle wanted this guy. The mask is practically covering his whole face. He's hoping the kids wouldn't notice. But the kids did notice. So after one season, the third season was over. For the fourth season, guess who was back as the Lone Ranger? Clayton Moore. The last live radio show was September 3rd, 1954. They had 3,377 radio shows. Then it ended. The television show still continued with Clayton Moore. Warner Brothers in 1956 released a movie with Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels called The Lone Ranger. The TV show ended June 6, 1957, but in 1958, the two main characters came back. They weren't on television anymore, but they came back for another movie, The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold. And this was basically the last appearance of the Lone Ranger. I'm going to talk to you now about what happened to some of the people. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good news here. What happened to some of the major personalities. We know that Earl Grouser died. He died when he fell asleep at the wheel. He's buried. It's funny that some of these people are buried right in this area. He's buried at Grand Lawn Cemetery in Grand River near Telegraph. I was there like in January trying to find his grave, but there was too much snow. I'm going to go back and try to find it. But there's a picture of it. Fran Stryker, the writer, was driving on a highway and he was going over a hill, saw a bunch of cars stopped in front of him. He tried to swerve to avoid him and he ran head on to another car and was killed instantly. He was from Buffalo and he's buried in Arcade Rural Cemetery in Wyoming County, New York. Now, this is the Troy connection that I was talking about. Anybody know a Troy connection between? Okay, what?
Brace Beamer is buried in Whitechapel.
There you go. Brace Beamer is buried in Whitechapel. There's his grave right there. It's about a mile from here. I could take you, I mean, I go there like three times a year to clean up the grave. We especially go during Memorial Day when they have that special service. He's buried with all the World War I veterans by the polar bear. He's right on, there's a road that goes down past the polar bear heading toward Crooks. If you follow that road, he's the first person on that road. You can't, it's not that hard to find. And you could ask the people at the cemetery to find it, but it's not that hard to find. There's no indication on his grave that this person was ever anybody important. The only thing is a little horse that's on his grave. He's buried with his wife, Lita. I was hoping that they would somehow have a Michigan historical sign somewhere, but they don't. Mr. Trendle, let's see, where's he buried? Trendle is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, 8 Mile Woodward. Jay Silverheels died in 1980, and he's buried in Los Angeles. And so was Clayton Moore. He died in 1999. John Hart died in 2009, and he was cremated. Fred Foy died in 2010. He's buried in Massachusetts. Now we're going to tell you a little bit about the Maccabees building. My friend and I, we were trying to find we wanted to see the studios of WXYZ, so we got in an elevator. We said, let's go to the top floor first and try to find it. So we got up to the 14th floor. It's as high as the elevator takes you, the 14th floor. We looked all around. We could not find anything that looked like a radio station, so we went down and down, did every floor. Finally, we got down to floor number 2, and we couldn't find it, so we pressed the button for the elevator. The doors open, we get in, and there's a man standing in there. So we're going down to the first floor. He says, what's the problem, guys? You look a little sad. And we said, well, we tried to find the WXYZ studios, and we couldn't find it. The man says, well, it's up on the 15th floor. Turns out he's the building supervisor. And he unlocked the doors and let us go up in there. And since then, I've been there 3 times, and one time I took Shirley with me. And I've got some pictures now to show you what WXYZ Studios looks like today. I've been trying to get people to go up. I mean, I would love to take a group of people up there to show them if we could get Wayne State to agree. But I think they're a little bit worried about perhaps insurance purposes or something. Anyway, this is, you could only take the elevator to the 14th floor, but you had to walk up steps to the 15th floor. So these are the steps leading up to the WXYZ Studios in the front. This is the Woodward side. Behind the building, if you went up the other way, this is another building. There's like double doors and everything because they wanted to keep all the sounds from the traffic, but it's pretty high up. And so, this is a studio shot of what it looked like back in the day. This is what it looks like. Notice the window in the background. This is what the studio looks like today. This is the building supervisor's office. And I wish they didn't use this space, but they did. Notice the window. There's the window again. This is what the sound effects looked like back in the day. This is what it looks like now. The director's booth is on the left-hand side where Chuck Livingston or whoever would be giving the cues. That's what it looked like then, today. This is behind the sound. You can see there's hardly anything left. I expected to go in there and find signs and scripts laying around and microphones. There's none of that. This is inside the director's booth. Again, notice the window. That is on the south side of the building. If you look out that window, you'll see the Renaissance Center clearly. This is the outside of the director's booth. Going into the sound effects. This is kind of behind the sound effects. Again, there's a window facing south where you can see the Renaissance Center. There's nothing in here, but if there is one thing that I would like to have. I'm a collector of Lone Ranger memorabilia and radio material, and I just wish there was a way I could get this. There is one thing I want, and that's a toilet. This is just behind this area over here to the left. And the reason I want this is, do you know how many times the Lone Ranger, Tonto, Green Hornet, and Sergeant Preston would have used that toilet? Oh, I'd be in seventh heaven. My wife says absolutely not. She's sitting in the front row. I have now a little movie. Can we go with the movie? It's called Back of the Mic, and it's a 1938 movie. This is about sound effects, and it has a lot of the Lone Ranger cast in it. Tonto was in it, but there's no Lone Ranger. He didn't appear in this, but I'll try to point out Tonto to you. There's at least one character you'll get to see, but this is the Lone Ranger cast, and probably all these are all Lone Ranger actors and sound effects. So if we can see, it's an 11-minute movie by Jam Handy, a Detroit company.
And now we come to the thrilling final episode of our radio drama. Old Pete Belden, driver of the jitney from Carsonburg to Copper Springs, has a double load today. Pete's ancient bus is carrying the Flying Bee payroll and a passenger, his niece Betty. Little do Pete and Betty suspect as they chug over the desert wastelands that just around the next curve, Shifty Sam Hicks and his henchmen lie in wait.
It hasn't been the same without you, Betty, but now that you're back, you'll find nothing's changed and nothing's happened.
Nothing's happened? Why, I heard you had 2 new horses. I can't wait to give them a run.
You be careful where you ride these days. Got a band of rustlers operating in the neighborhood.
Oh, pooh. You don't seem very scared, carrying the payroll in every month.
But you better stick close to home.
All right, Uncle, don't worry. Now, how have the new...
Stay right there, buddy. Where's the Flying Bee payroll?
Here it is, Sam.
Give it here. And tie him on the horse. What about the girl? We didn't count on her being along.
We'll tie her in the car. Let's get going.
Meanwhile, Betty, frantic at her uncle's danger, has undone her bonds and is starting for help in the crippled car.
Sheriff Tom, hurry, hurry.
Betty, where's your Uncle Pete?
We were held up, Tom. 3 men. They took the Flying Bee payroll and headed up toward Pine Gap, and they took Uncle with them.
Come on in the house quick. We'll get the boys together and we'll go after them.
No, I'll take the jitney into town and get my car.
All right, Betty.
Hello?
Ring up the boys, man. Tell them to meet me at Pine Creek Forks. The Flying Bee payroll's been robbed. Pete Belden's been kidnapped. Tell the boys to ride. Hey, George, where'd you put that ammunition? It's in your desk. Which drawer? The middle one.
I declare, I'll never get these dishes done. Looks like a storm coming up, too. Hello, what is it?
Is Fred there, Mrs. Jones? Chef rounded up a posse.
I'll call him, May. He's out in the yard.
Send him to Pine Creek Forks. Hurry, Sophie.
Fred! Oh, Fred!
Hello!
Posse, Fred. Sheriff wants you at Pine Creek Forks. They're riding.
All right.
Oh, boss. Steady. Hey, Joe. We're saddling. Tom wants a posse. Something stern, I reckon.
All right, Fred. Better stop that windmill. We're going to storm.
See you later, Ma.
Be careful, Fred. Hello, May. They've gone. Have you got the other boys?
Some of them. I'm calling the blacksmith now.
Hello?
Shirley, payroll robbery. Meet the sheriff at Pine Creek Forks. Pick up Bill and Frank on the way.
I'm riding, Harry. Push that there wagon out of the way. Where's your pa, Junior?
He's back on the far section with the reaper.
Hey there, Bill. Get down off of that.
I can't hear you. Wait a minute. No, what you say?
Somebody held up the jitney. Probably the Hicks gang. Bring your horse. They've headed for Pine Creek. Guess they're going through the gap. Hurry up and I'll meet you at Frank's.
And so, as the storm breaks around them, the sheriff's posse gathers at Pine Creek Forks, prepared for action.
Men, Hicks and his gang have been around this country too long. We're going to clean them out today. But we got to remember that old Pete Belden is with them, and we don't want him to get hurt. All right, boys, let's hit out. Come on, men. We're gaining on them.
They've seen us, Tom.
Right, fellas. They probably have fresh horses at the creek.
Hold up there. We'll set fire to the gap and stop. Whoa! Slim, you chop a couple of them small trees.
Right.
We'll spread a fire they can't get through.
These are pretty green for burning, Sam.
Grass is dry as tinder here. That'll get it started. Shorty, you get some of that dead wood burning in a hurry.
Grass is catching on. It's dry, all right.
How about the trees, Slim? Out ready?
Move back. He's coming now.
Got another one farther back. Apache's closing in on us. Here they come. We better hold them off till this fire gets too hot to cross. Slim, Shorty, over that side.
All right. That fire's sure too hot for us, Sheriff. And they can get out of range anytime they want to mount. Looks like they'll give us a slip.
Why couldn't you get through in my car, Sheriff? They might do something to Uncle if we don't hurry.
I'll bet we could get through in the car if we got a good start.
It's worth a try. Who'll drive it?
Don't forget he's my uncle, Sheriff. I'll drive it through myself.
You'll drive nothing. Get out and get behind the tree.
They're mounting up, Sheriff. They're heading down the creek.
All right, Jack, let's go. Two of you men come with us. The rest of you keep firing.
Slim, come on. Follow me. All right, forward. This way. Come on. All right, come on. Keep going, boys.
we leave old Pete safe and sound with Betty in her new car. And to our friends of the radio audience, we bid a pleasant good night.
I love that movie. When radio and TV were simultaneously broadcast, Art Linkletter asked one of the kids, what do you like better, radio or television? And the child replied, he liked radio because the pictures were better. Now we could turn the lights on, and Shirley has agreed, and if anyone has any questions about the Lone Ranger, you've got a person here who is actually on the show, and this is your last chance to get a person to ask that question you've been dying to ask. So if anyone has a question, who are we going to pick? Okay, there's a man right there.
They said Bryce Beaver is buried at Whitechapel. There's the Three Prophets. Is that anywhere near the Three Prophets? When you come in off of 18 Mile Road, you turn right and go around, and there's the Three Prophets between that road and Cook's Road.
I had right to the main building. Right when you pull in, you go straight. And then there's a road that cuts off to the right-hand side heading toward Crooks. It's over there, and there's a polar bear there. There's a white polar bear, a large polar bear, about the full-size polar bear. It's right down that road, and it's right next to the road, so that's the best I can help you with, and you should be able to find it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. My mother, Helen Heimbach, did some parts. Probably, I'm not sure if she was there in 1938, but she mentioned John Todd and Bryce Beamer doing some radio parts with them. Could have been 37, 36. Do any of those pictures, do you recognize the name? And do you have the names to any of those early, like 33, 34, 35 pictures? The women in there?
I recognize some of them, but not the women. You know, there were just a few women, and I didn't have much interaction.
Yeah.
Because there weren't a lot of
She would have been about 24 years old in 1938.
Yeah, she did very well with that.
But, you know.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, we have a question back here.
I have a question. Other guys are all dressed in suits. Is that what the decor was? I mean, at that time?
Yes.
Yes. You didn't go to work in just casual.
No, even the songmen, if you notice.
Everybody's in suits.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that some people might think they dress like the characters.
Ball games, yeah.
They never dressed as the Lone Ranger, only in public figures.
Didn't have catch-all.
Yeah, I had someone ask me, maybe it was Larry, if I didn't feel like kind of awe standing across from Lone Ranger. And incidentally, you saw the microphone, that was stationary. So they had a big green box that I stood on so that I could picture. But I didn't feel in awe because I was doing a job. You know, I was just there and I took it in stride, and they were all wonderfully nice to me as a kid. So.
Question back here?
Do they still play Lone Ranger on cable TV or TCM or any?
If you go to YouTube, if you go to YouTube, you'll probably find it.
But they don't play it on the other sites.
TVs and Buzz, I don't see it right there. Well, we have another question here.
The TV program was on Saturday, and I took care of my younger brother and sister, and we religiously watched Big Top Circus and then the Lone Ranger, and so I would say that the Lone Ranger was my babysitter.
Absolutely.
Yes. What was your scenario when you were on the show? Like, what did you play? What did you do?
What kind of characters?
Yeah.
I mean, it was always a child, of course. I started on Lone Ranger actually at 35, and so you can do the math again. I left it in 44. And it was always a child in distress.
Oh.
I always had to be rescued. So I whimpered a lot. I could cry on cue.
She played a boy a lot too. Did you play a boy?
I play boys sometimes because at that age the voices are interchangeable. You know, 7, 8, 9 week voices. Right.
How did you get your job doing this?
How did she get the job?
I what?
No, I'm repeating it.
Oh,
Thank you. Anyone who didn't hear it, how did she get the job?
Yeah. I was on a children's radio program called the Children's Theater of the Air, and we broadcast live every Sunday from the Broadway Capitol Theater, which is now the Opera House. And so we rehearsed on Saturday at the McAfee's building, and then the show aired on Sunday. So we were at a rehearsal, and Russell Knapp was his name, one of the directors came in, took me by hand, like going out of the room when my mother was all over him. Taking my daughter. And so they said we wanted her to read for a commercial. And it was a AAA commercial. I did a lot of Cheerios commercials too. It was AAA, and I read well at 7, and that was it. They just called me then whenever they needed to call my mom.
Way in the back here.
If you don't mind, back some years ago on Rochester Road between 18 and 19 on the west side, the corner street behind Boston Chicken now, there was a house there that was lived in or owned by one of the, are you familiar with that?
No. Are you, Larry?
No.
Okay.
Can't help you on that.
Okay, because okay, I'll just say my husband was a policeman in Troy, and they always watched out for that corner because they said that was so-and-so's house and lived there. That was one of those men.
No, I wonder who.
Ray Stever was in Oxford, and once a year they have an Oxford Festival. And they'll have it this year. Shirley was the guest of honor a couple of years ago. They made her a coach, and she said they made her feel like a queen.
I said when I started out with this horse and buggy, it was wonderful, and I'm thinking, what am I doing here? I got to the street, all these wonderful people were waving. I suddenly became Miss America. Waving at everybody. It was so much fun.
You have a picture of you as a child? Pardon? Pictures? You have pictures of you as a child?
I mean, I do, but I don't have any. I don't have a lot because I did have, and my family and kids, we had a house there.
There's somebody, let's not miss that person way back.
Yeah, there are some stations, if you don't have cable, on Antenna TV that you can see some of the older TV programs, including Lone Ranger. What the timing is, I have no idea, because they interchange also on decades on TV, and decades on TV will show some of these programs. So, but Buzzer TV and Me TV and I can't think of the others. Reels, there's Reels, but I'm not sure about
Westerns
that.
channel also.
Yes, what's that?
There's a Westerns channel on one of the cable stations that if you subscribe to it, they show a lot of the older Westerns.
I know we have at least 2 questions, one over there, a couple over there, and one back here.
Yes. Can you share your name again?
Pardon?
What is your name?
My name is Shirley.
Your last name?
Russell was Russell when I was on the radio.
I try to just use Shirley's name when she was on the radio, because if she uses her name, what her name is now, she gets all this kind of unwanted fan mail.
It's like, this was a whole resurgence to me because I was such a kid when I did all that. And, got married, had kids, lived my life, didn't talk to people about the radio. Radio actors are never recognizable, obviously. Nobody ever sees you. And so I just kind of put in the background some fond memories. And then I met Larry. And the first time was at Macomb So it's been like a resurgence. And then from there, with the internet, I Googled myself. And I couldn't believe it. And now I'm getting fan mail, for heaven's sake, at this age.
I know you've been dying back there to ask.
The daughter-in-law, Joan Beamer, lived in Troy in the Northfield Hills condominiums in the 70s, and she taught at Harlem School.
The daughter?
Daughter-in-law, married to
daughter-in-law. I know the Beamers, I know the Barbara Grace had 2 sons and a daughter, and I know the 2 sons from the daughter, their name is Daniels. When she married, her name went from Beamer to Daniels. So these 2 they were the guests of honor at the Oxford Festival a couple of years ago. But I don't know of any brother-in-laws or sister-in-laws.
Daughter-in-law.
Daughter-in-law.
Well, that's why I'm wondering if that's why the Beamers are buried in Whitechapel, because I often wondered why they weren't buried in Oxford.
Yeah, I don't know that either.
Because they had the farm up there, right? And his horse was up there.
Shirley, tell us about when Grouser died, what it did to you.
Well, it was really hard for me. He was very sweet to me, very nice, and kind of gentle guy. And so he was the Lone Ranger to me, and worked with him. And some of these memories, it's so long ago, not positive, but I believe I worked on the program with him the night he was killed going home. And I was just heartbroken and stunned. I want part of Bruce Beamer. But this is a child's point of view, and it was such a big change for me. But I was on the program again when Brace hadn't been on there that long, and he was very nice, and he certainly did look the part more. But Earl was my guy.
Larry, are the radio programs available on YouTube also, or on the internet?
You can get the radio station show on YouTube. If you just search enough, you'll find it.
Okay.
What it'll be is it'll just be a screen with maybe a picture.
Okay.
It won't be any moving pictures.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can hear almost any show you want. I love a lot of other shows other than the Lone Rangers. Captain Midnight's my favorite. Superman. And Superman was one. There were so many good ones. I love the children's shows, but then there was the adventure shows, the Inner Sanctum, and then the comedy shows. My favorite one was Vic and Save, and there was Fibber and Molly and Jack Benny. All those shows are great. If you just listen to the shows, you'll realize what it is, why it's so bad that we don't have them anymore. But you can buy as many shows you want on MP3s, like on eBay. You can get like over 1,000 Lone Ranger shows for probably $10. You can play them in your car, listen to them. Radio shows are best when you're driving at night, and it's late at night, and you've got a long distance to drive.
Yeah.
Or the Shadow.
If you're interested in purchasing them, I think oldies.com does have like a CD or DVD of them. But if you go to oldtimeradio.com, you can see every single one of the Lone Ranger episodes there, and you can play them on your oldtimeradio.com.
Anybody? Here's a question.
Did you have a favorite episode that you remember? No.
No, I really don't. And my parts weren't huge. I was kind of a minor character. So I had favorite things I did other than Lone Ranger, like being plays and things like that.
That were much.
But Lone Ranger was always pretty.
Did you just save the one script?
Yeah. Yeah, my mom picked it up when I was really in the studio.
Tell us about your mom, where she was at.
They had a little soundproof booth off to the right. You saw the director's booth, and then off to the right they had this little booth. And so my mom would sit in there with the soundproof, so play them on the outside noise, of course. But maybe of interest to you, I think about it now. We broadcast live at 7:30 to Detroit in the Midwest. There was no recording at that time. Oh my God, that's old, isn't it? And then we stayed until 10:30 and broadcast live again to the West Coast.
That's why Grouser was driving so late at night.
Right. And that was, a long time, and I can remember certainly falling asleep. But some of the men fell asleep too because they'd been out and had a couple pops. In between shows. Tonto was famous for falling asleep in his chair.
You took acting lessons.
He was such a sweet man. He was a Shakespearean actor. And,
Really?
But he did teach at the conservatory, which used to be next to the his building. And I did take lessons from him.
When Shirley was on the show, her mother was getting autographs.
Yes, I got almost all those guys on there. So. I am really happy that she did that. Including Earl Grouser, which we think was probably the only one there is. Anyway.
Shirley, as a child actress, did you know about the kinds of sound effects, or were you kind of surprised to see how they actually came up with those?
Well, yeah, I was shocked to see it. And it was right visible. When I was standing up on the box, they were right off to my right. And only when the horses, they didn't do this thing. They had a trough with dirt in it and no plungers. Yes, it was hard to keep your eyes off watching the sound effect. You heard Larry say that I got together with Bill Hengstebeck. I did. Bill was on this children's theater, The Air, that I mentioned. He was tap dancer, so was I, sang. And then Bill went in the war, in World War II. And when he came back, that's when he went on the Lone Ranger. So we didn't ever, paths never crossed there. And of course, I Googled him and found him. He had lived in Arizona for a long time. And I had lunch with him and his wife about a week ago. He's 90. And it was just delightful. And I said to him, how are we going to know each other? It's been 70 years. Good grief. He said, well, I'm short and bald. I said, well, I'm short and blonde. So there you go. And we found each other. There was something I recognized. That was so much fun.
There's a question over there.
Have you continued your acting career?
No, I didn't. I did my last Cheerios commercial when I was 16, and that was it. And that was the only show I did on the Jefferson Avenue studios. And in fact, my husband-to-be picked me up from that commercial, and that was it. Some of the women that worked on the show really wanted me to get into summer stock and all, but I didn't, and I've never regretted it.
Okay, there's a question here.
So actually this one's for you. So you're showing the slides. There was a warning on the bottom of the gum for parents and teachers. Did you ever read it?
No.
It just said parents and teachers. Like it was a warning like we see today on the bottom of everything. And it was on the gum package.
That gum wrapper is probably worth about $200.
It probably said, "Don't chew it in school." Your sister's hair.
Were you ever in the Green Hornet?
Yep.
Oh.
I was on the Green Hornet and Challenge of the Yukon. Wow. All three, yeah. I worked quite a bit. And Detroit was so big in radio then, and almost as big as Chicago. So, yeah, I did have quite a bit of work. And I did one show at WWJ they did a radio adaptation of the movie Wings. Everybody remembers that old movie? And I played a boy in that. And this was done on stage, so they had to come out and let the audience know that the boy was going to be played by a girl. And everybody snickering. So.
Did you have private tutors, go to public school? What did you do? How did you
I went to
work
public
till
school.
10:30 at night?
Yeah, it wasn't that often. I went to public school, and it just became pretty routine that the studio would call my mom, and you know, the school knew about it, she'd come and pick me up. But it wasn't like I was doing that every week or, you know, it was.
Children's parts on Lone Ranger were very rare.
Yeah, and all those shows were all.
But you did other shows too, right? You said something about you had other favorite shows that you did? Other stage shows maybe?
Oh, yes, I did. I did some.
That you enjoyed doing.
Theater.
Any other questions? Your last chance to ask the radio star.
How were you paid?
Yeah. Pardon?
How were you paid, by the hour?
No, I was paid, don't you ask me that. When I did the 7:30 live and the 10:30 live, $10. And then, I think I've been working for a couple of years, and then we became union. And it went up to 34. But, you know, eventually, they didn't have to do the 2 performances live. I think didn't they have enormous records that they first recorded on?
The Lone Ranger was recorded onto 16-inch records. The reason they had to be so large was because that's the technology of the day. To get a 15-minute piece of broadcasting, you needed a really large record to do it. So the records are 16 inches across. You need a special record player to play them. I actually own one, and I had a lot of these discs. And what they did was they would take the discs and then they would send them to like faraway places. They would send them as far away as New Zealand. The New Zealand kids had a Lone Ranger club that they had badges. And I got some of those badges. So the Lone Ranger was heard all the way from Detroit, all the way to Europe, and all the way over to New Zealand.
And my most prestigious thing about being on the radio was that the Lone Ranger was Shirley Temple's favorite program.
Shirley loved Shirley Temple. And Shirley Temple was a Lone Ranger safety scout. Shirley Temple entered the contest and won first prize. So they felt bad about getting into a movie star, so they gave another boy like half the prize. Shirley Temple was a Lone Ranger fan. Ray Speaker's voice was known second only to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. His voice recognition was second only to Roosevelt's. That's how popular the show is. He was invited to the White House. These were important times. Radio was our only form of entertainment, like free entertainment.
Another factoid that I think is interesting is that John Todd, who played Tana, was on every single broadcast.
Yeah.
And the day it, debuted until it went off the air. Wow. Every broadcast.
Where did you live?
Where did I live? I lived on the east side of Detroit, near Caddo Moore.
She took the trolley.
We took the buses, basically, and until we got to Woodward, then we took a streetcar.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, streetcar.
They would drop her off in front of the Matthews building, didn't they?
Yeah.